Hi, my name is Gina Allen. I'm doing a Christian worldview assignment over Chapter 1 of the book, Learning from the Stranger, Christian Faith and Cultural Diversity by David I. Smith. Chapter 1 is entitled How Not to Bless the Nations. The author discusses Genesis chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. The main characters are Abraham, who's considered to be the first of the Hebrew patriarchs and a figure revered by the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Sarah, his wife, and Abimelech, who is the king of Gerar. Abraham, who is a stranger, fears the new land he is in, so he tells his wife to lie about them being married and to say that she is his sister, which he justifies later by saying that she is the daughter of his father and his father's wife. Abimelech adds Sarah to his harem, but hasn't consummated with her. He has a dream where God tells him he is as good as dead because Sarah is married to Abraham, a prophet. If he does not return Sarah, God warns him in verse 7 that he and his family will die. Abimelech summons Abraham to ask him why he would ever jeopardize his and his family's life. Abraham assumed that the people of Gerar had no fear of God. He was afraid he would be killed because of Sarah, even though he had been promised by God that he would be the father of many nations just a few chapters ago in Genesis chapter 17. So the author talks about his theory that Abraham's failures have at least four causes: fear, power, knowledge, perspective. With regard to fear, the author points out that, quote, there is a peculiar vulnerability involved in being a stranger, a migrant, a refugee, an exile, any kind of alien. Abraham was far from everything that was familiar to him. He was far from home. Another failure on Abraham's part is power. Even though he was wealthy, he was powerless. Interestingly, the king was instructed by God to have this stranger intercede for him. In this case, the king relinquished his power only after Abraham had already given his power away. The author also talks about knowledge, or really a partial knowledge, being one of Abraham's failures. In this case, he was stereotyping the entire region as being godless. He assumes wrongly in verse 11 that, quote, surely there is not fear of God in this place. Lastly, the author believes that Abraham has limited perspective. Little did he think the people in Gerar believed and feared God, let alone that God would speak to the king through a dream and not to Abraham. There is much I agreed with this that was in this chapter. The author did a nice job of breaking down the portion of Scripture into chunks that allow us to see through the eyes of a stranger, a foreigner, a migrant. That it must go beyond missionary training. There are cultural differences all around us. There is not anything I disagree with. Mr. Smith did an excellent job of pointing out how a stranger can feel so vulnerable. One thing I would have him add, and he may very well do that later in the book, but to touch on how vulnerable not just strangers or foreigners feel, but those on the fringe of society. For example, there are many people who feel vulnerable who have always lived among us, like the disabled, the extremely poor, the undereducated, just to name a few. The cultural iceberg is one theory that seems to represent this portion of Scripture. For example, in an iceberg, we only see a small portion of the mass itself. What is seen is usually the behavior. So Abraham and Sarah pretended to not be married, so they appeared to be brother and sister to any observer, namely the king. However, below the surface is what is supporting those behaviors. This visual aid shows interpretations, which really is what Abraham did. He reasoned that the people of Gerar were godless, and he acted on that limiting perspective. The visual aid also shows core values. Abraham was afraid for his life, and he felt that he was powerless. There are also outside influences that keep adding to the bottom of the iceberg. Family dynamics, money, religion. These things are below the surface, so others often do not know what motivates our behaviors. It was a very interesting chapter, and I am looking forward to reading more. Thank you.